The scorching afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the parched landscape of western Colorado Territory. Thomas Morgan wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he surveyed the barren expanse before him. At 45, the former Union cavalry officer had seen his fair share of hardship, from the blood-soaked battlefields of Antietam to the unforgiving wilderness of the frontier. His calloused hands gripped the reins of his dappled gray stallion, a beast as stubborn and resilient as its master. 3 days of hard riding had left both man and horse exhausted, but Thomas knew he was close. The Blackwater Ranch lay just beyond the next ridge, and with it, the answers he had spent the last 5 years searching for. 5 long years since he'd returned home to find his own ranch burned to the ground, his wife Elizabeth buried beneath the charred remains, and his life savings stolen. 5 years of tracking whispered rumors and faded trails that all led to one name: Jeremiah Sullivan. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Where are you watching from today? The setting sun cast long shadows across the valley as Thomas approached the sprawling ranch. Blackwater was everything his own modest spread had never been. Vast, prosperous, and well-defended. A dozen buildings surrounded the main house, which stood 2 stories tall, with a wide porch and ornate woodwork that seemed out of place on the frontier. Smoke billowed from the chimney despite the summer heat, and lanterns were being lit as dusk settled over the property. From a distance, Thomas spotted ranch hands corralling cattle into pens, their movements practiced and efficient. Sullivan had clearly done well for himself in the years since he'd arrived in Colorado. Too well, perhaps, for a man who'd shown up with nothing but the clothes on his back and a suspiciously heavy saddlebag. Thomas kept to the tree line, watching and waiting. He'd learned patience during the war, learned that rushing in without reconnaissance was a good way to end up dead, and dead men couldn't deliver justice. As darkness fell, Thomas made his approach, leading his horse slowly toward the ranch house. He'd fabricated a story about being a cattle buyer from Denver, looking to purchase stock for Eastern markets. It wasn't uncommon for such men to arrive unannounced, hoping to catch ranchers before their competitors. What was uncommon was the Colt Navy revolver hidden beneath his trail-worn duster, loaded with 6 bullets, 5 for Sullivan's hired guns, if necessary, and 1 specifically for the man himself. As Thomas neared the house, he was struck by an unusual observation. No men appeared to be present on the property. The hands he'd seen earlier had disappeared, and the ranch seemed eerily quiet, save for the distant lowing of cattle. A lone figure sat on the porch, rocking slowly in a chair, the ember of a cigarette glowing in the darkness. As Thomas drew closer, he realized with surprise that it was a woman, her silhouette unmistakable against the lamplight spilling from the windows behind her. "Evening, stranger," the woman called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "You're a long way from anywhere." She stood as Thomas approached, revealing herself to be tall and striking, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. She wore men's work clothes, denim trousers, and a cotton shirt. But there was nothing mannish about her bearing. A shotgun rested casually against the porch railing within easy reach. Thomas tipped his hat, maintaining the charade he'd rehearsed countless times. "Ma'am," he replied cordially, "name's Thomas Morgan. I'm looking for Jeremiah Sullivan. I understand he owns this spread." "Okay." He watched her face carefully for any reaction, but her expression remained impassive. "I'm a buyer from Denver, interested in purchasing cattle for Eastern markets." The woman regarded him with cool appraisal, Her eyes narrowed slightly as she took in his dust-covered appearance and the exhaustion evident in his posture. After a moment, she seemed to come to a decision and gestured toward the house. "Mr. Sullivan isn't here," she said, picking up her shotgun with practiced ease. "Hasn't been for some time. I'm Rebecca Sullivan. This is my ranch now." She stepped aside, indicating he should enter. "You look like you could use a meal and a place to rest your horse. We can discuss business in the morning." Thomas hesitated, thrown off balance by this unexpected development. Sullivan gone? The man he'd tracked across 3 states had vanished once again? Frustration threatened to overwhelm him, but he maintained his composure. Perhaps this woman knew something. Perhaps she was even protecting her husband. Either way, accepting her hospitality would give him the opportunity to learn more. Inside the ranch house, Thomas found himself seated at a large oak dining table that could easily accommodate 20 people. The interior was surprisingly refined, with quality furniture, colorful woven rugs, and oil paintings in gilded frames adorning the walls. Rebecca Sullivan moved about the kitchen with efficient grace, producing a hearty stew, fresh bread, and a bottle of surprisingly good whiskey. As she set the food before him, the door opened, and 2 more women entered. "My sisters," Rebecca explained, as they regarded Thomas with undisguised curiosity. Catherine and Mary. The family resemblance was unmistakable. All 3 shared the same high cheekbones, determined jaw, and penetrating gaze. Catherine, the oldest of the 3 judging by the fine lines around her eyes, offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mary, significantly younger, perhaps not yet 20, studied him openly, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Ladies," Thomas acknowledged with a nod, increasingly uncomfortable under their collective scrutiny. Something about the situation felt wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Your hospitality is appreciated. I won't impose for long." Catherine slid into the chair opposite him, her movements controlled and deliberate. "Nonsense," she said, filling a glass with whiskey and pushing it toward him. "It's rare we get visitors these days. The men don't come around much anymore." The way she said it sent a chill down Thomas's spine, despite the warm room. "The men?" he inquired, taking a careful sip of the whiskey. Mary laughed, the sound incongruously bright in the tense atmosphere. "The cowhands," she clarified. "They don't stay long at Blackwater. Isn't that right, Rebecca?" The eldest Sullivan sister shot Mary a warning glance before turning back to Thomas. "Tell me, Mr. Morgan," Rebecca said, changing the subject, "what brought you to our remote corner of the territory? Denver buyers usually send telegrams ahead." Thomas recognized the question for what it was, a test of his story. He launched into his prepared explanation about beef prices and Eastern demand, weaving in enough details about the cattle business to sound convincing. As he spoke, he observed the sisters carefully. Mary seemed bored by the business talk, but Catherine and Rebecca exchanged glances several times, something unspoken passing between them. When he finished, Catherine leaned forward slightly. "And you came alone? Most cattle buyers travel with associates or at least hired protection. The trails aren't safe these days." Thomas patted the revolver at his hip. "I can handle myself, ma'am. Served with the 7th Cavalry during the war." This wasn't strictly true. He'd been with the 4th, but he doubted they'd know the difference. Dinner proceeded with stilted conversation, the sisters asking pointed questions about his background and business, while revealing little about themselves or the absent Jeremiah Sullivan. Thomas learned only that the man had established the ranch 10 years earlier, had married Rebecca shortly thereafter, and had moved on approximately 3 years ago. When he inquired about Sullivan's current whereabouts, the sisters exchanged another of those meaningful glances before Rebecca simply said, "We don't rightly know." After the meal, Rebecca showed Thomas to a small but comfortable guest room on the ground floor. "Rest well," she said, lingering in the doorway. "We'll discuss your cattle business in the morning." There was something in her tone that suggested she didn't believe his story for a moment. As she closed the door behind her, Thomas heard the distinct sound of a key turning in the lock. Thomas waited until the house had fallen silent before making his move. The locked door presented little challenge, a simple pin-tumbler mechanism that yielded easily to the thin metal file he kept in his boot for such purposes. Moving silently through the darkened house, he searched for any sign of Sullivan or evidence of the man's current location. The main study yielded ledgers showing the ranch's finances, surprisingly robust given the apparent lack of regular hands, but nothing indicating where Sullivan might have gone. Frustrated, Thomas turned his attention to the upper floor, where the sisters presumably slept. The stairs creaked treacherously beneath his weight, but the sound of wind picking up outside helped mask his ascent. At the top of the stairs, he paused, listening intently. 3 doors led off the hallway, presumably bedrooms. From behind one, he could hear soft voices. The sisters were still awake. Pressing his ear against the door, Thomas strained to make out their words. "Don't believe him for a moment," Catherine was saying, her voice low but intense. "The way he asked about Jeremiah. He's not a cattle buyer." Rebecca's voice came next, measured and thoughtful. "No, he's not. But he might be useful all the same. We need a man's help with the North Pasture situation." Mary's voice chimed in, sounding amused. "He's handsome enough, despite the trail dust. Better looking than the last one." A bark of laughter from Catherine. "Beauty doesn't matter, if he's as weak-willed as the others. Remember Jensen? Couldn't even—" Thomas leaned closer, eager to hear more, but his boots scuffed against the wooden floorboard, producing an audible scrape. Instantly, the voices fell silent. Thomas froze, his hand moving instinctively to his holster. After a moment of tense stillness, he heard movement inside the room and knew he'd been discovered. Before he could retreat downstairs, the door swung open, revealing Rebecca Sullivan with an oil lamp in one hand and a Remington Derringer in the other, its twin barrels pointed squarely at Thomas's chest. Behind her, Catherine and Mary appeared, both similarly armed. "Mr. Morgan," Rebecca said coolly, as if finding strange men eavesdropping outside her bedroom in the middle of the night was a common occurrence. "It seems we need to have a conversation sooner rather than later." She gestured with the Derringer. "Inside, please." Thomas considered his options. He could likely draw his Colt before any of them could fire, but 3 against 1 presented poor odds, especially in close quarters. Reluctantly, he entered the bedroom, noting with surprise that it appeared to be shared by all 3 sisters. 3 beds were arranged around the spacious room, each with a trunk at its foot. "Sit," Catherine commanded, indicating a chair near the window. Thomas complied, keeping his hands visible. "Now then," Rebecca began, perching on the edge of her bed while keeping her Derringer trained on him. "Why don't you tell us who you really are and what you want with Jeremiah Sullivan?" Thomas measured his response carefully. These women were clearly dangerous, but they might also possess the information he needed. Perhaps a partial truth would serve him best. "I'm looking for Sullivan because he wronged me," he admitted. 5 years ago, he and his associates attacked my ranch in Wyoming Territory. They killed my wife and stole everything I had. The confession hung in the air between them. Thomas watched for any sign of shock or disbelief, but found none. Instead, to his surprise, Mary let out a soft laugh. "Well," she said, glancing at her sisters, "he certainly sounds like our Jeremiah." Catherine's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. Indeed, always taking what didn't belong to him. Dawn broke over Blackwater Ranch, painting the land in hues of gold and amber. Thomas stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand, contemplating the extraordinary tale he'd heard during the night. According to the Sullivan sisters, Jeremiah Sullivan had been a con man and murderer long before he'd established Blackwater. Rebecca, the eldest, had been his wife in name only, a convenient legal arrangement that allowed him to acquire the land. Catherine and Mary were not actually her sisters, but fellow victims of Sullivan's schemes. The 3 women, initially strangers to one another, had been brought to Blackwater under false pretenses and essentially held prisoner, forced to work the ranch while Sullivan enjoyed the profits. Over time, they'd formed an alliance, awaiting an opportunity to free themselves from his control. That opportunity had come 3 years ago, when Sullivan had returned from a trip to Denver with a fresh wound from a barroom brawl. Feverish and weakened, he'd been vulnerable for the first time. "We didn't plan it," Rebecca had explained, her voice devoid of remorse. "But when the moment presented itself, we acted. All 3 of us together." What they'd done with Sullivan's body afterward, they wouldn't say directly, though Mary had cryptically mentioned that the North Pasture has always been particularly fertile. In the years since, they'd maintained the fiction that Sullivan was simply away on business, gradually selling off cattle and land to sustain themselves while trying to develop a plan for the future. The ranch hands had been dismissed one by one as funds dwindled, until only the 3 women remained, defending their hard-won freedom with shotguns and determination. Thomas had listened to their confession with growing amazement, recognizing in their story a dark reflection of his own quest for vengeance. Sullivan had already faced justice, not by his hand as he'd planned for 5 long years, but at the hands of other victims whose suffering mirrored his own. Rebecca joined him on the porch, her expression guarded but no longer hostile. "Have you decided what you'll do now, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, watching him carefully. Thomas considered the question. His single-minded pursuit of vengeance had defined him for so long that its sudden absence left him adrift. "I'm not sure," he admitted finally. "I came here to kill Sullivan. Finding him already dead, it changes things." Rebecca nodded, understanding in her eyes. Revenge is a powerful motivator, but a poor foundation for a life. We 3 learned that lesson watching Jeremiah destroy himself bit by bit with his hatreds and grudges. She gestured toward the expansive ranch before them. "We've been trying to hold on to this place, but it's too much for us alone. The North Range is threatened by rustlers, and the bank in Denver is making noises about calling in Sullivan's loans." Thomas understood what she was proposing before she said it. "You need a man to help run the ranch, someone who knows cattle and can handle a gun." Rebecca met his gaze directly. "We need a partner, Mr. Morgan. Someone with as much reason as we have to maintain the fiction that Jeremiah Sullivan is still alive somewhere. Someone who understands what it means to lose everything and fight to build something new." The offer was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Thomas had no home to return to, no purpose beyond the vengeance that had been denied him. Here was an opportunity to begin again, to help these women who had suffered as he had suffered, to build rather than destroy. "I'll need to think on it," he said finally, unwilling to commit immediately despite the appeal of the proposition. As Thomas contemplated his unexpected change in circumstances, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, approaching rapidly from the direction of town. Rebecca tensed beside him, her hand moving instinctively to the shotgun leaning against the porch railing. "Were you expecting visitors?" Thomas asked, his own hand dropping to his holster. "No," she replied grimly, and unexpected visitors rarely bring good news. Within minutes, 5 riders had pulled up in front of the house, their horses lathered from hard riding. The leader, a heavy-set man with an elaborate waxed mustache and expensive Eastern clothing, dismounted awkwardly. "Mrs. Sullivan," he called out, removing his derby hat. "Harold Pinkerton, representing the First Bank of Denver. I'm afraid I have some rather pressing business concerning your husband's loans." Behind him, his companions remained mounted, their hands hovering near their weapons. Rebecca straightened her spine, facing the banker with remarkable composure. "Mr. Pinkerton, my husband is away on business, as I've informed your bank repeatedly." The banker smiled thinly, his eyes cold. "Yes, so you've said, for 3 years now. Yet strangely, no one has seen or heard from Jeremiah Sullivan in all that time. The bank has been patient, Mrs. Sullivan, but patience has limits. We've come to inspect the property we've been financing and to speak with Mr. Sullivan directly." His gaze shifted to Thomas. "And who might this be?" Before Rebecca could answer, Thomas stepped forward, extending his hand. "Thomas Morgan, Mr. Pinkerton, Sullivan's new foreman, just arrived from Wyoming to help manage the operation while he's attending to business interests back east." The banker's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but he shook Thomas's hand. "A foreman? With no hands to manage?" Pinkerton gestured to the conspicuously empty ranch yard. Thomas smiled easily, falling into the deception with practiced skill honed during years of tracking Sullivan. "Just hired a new crew in town yesterday. They'll be arriving tomorrow to begin the spring roundup. Mrs. Sullivan has been managing admirably, but with beef prices rising in Denver, Mr. Sullivan thought it time to expand operations." Thomas could feel Rebecca's surprise beside him, but trusted her to maintain the facade. Pinkerton seemed unconvinced. "Convenient timing, Mr. Morgan. The bank has grown increasingly concerned about the status of our investment here. Sullivan's loans are substantially in arrears." His tone hardened. "In fact, I have documentation authorizing foreclosure proceedings in the absence of immediate payment or proof that the ranch remains a viable enterprise." Catherine and Mary had emerged from the house during this exchange, positioning themselves strategically on either side of the porch, each with a rifle held casually but ready. The banker's companions shifted uncomfortably, clearly not having anticipated armed resistance from women. Thomas recognized the tension building toward violence and sought to diffuse it. "Perhaps we should discuss this matter like businessmen, Mr. Pinkerton. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement beneficial to all parties." He gestured toward the house. "Mrs. Sullivan makes excellent coffee, and I imagine your men could use refreshment after their ride." The suggestion of civilized negotiation appealed to Pinkerton's sense of propriety. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded his agreement, though he motioned for 2 of his men to join them while the others remained with the horses. Inside, seated around the dining table, Thomas laid out a convincing fiction about Blackwater's operations and Sullivan's business ventures. Drawing on his knowledge of the cattle industry and his observations of the ranch, he painted a picture of temporary setbacks but promising prospects, all requiring just a little more time and investment. Pinkerton remained skeptical, but was gradually swayed by Thomas's confident presentation and the supporting details offered by Rebecca and her sisters. By the time Catherine served apple pie, a peace offering that went some way toward relaxing the atmosphere, Pinkerton was considering alternatives to immediate foreclosure. "I could perhaps extend the loan terms," he mused, dabbing crumbs from his mustache. "With appropriate guarantees, of course, and increased interest to compensate for the risk." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, though inwardly he recognized the offer for what it was: legalized extortion. "Perhaps Mr. Sullivan might consider a partnership arrangement," Thomas suggested, watching Pinkerton's eyes light up with interest. The bank would receive a percentage of profits rather than merely interest on loans. With the new railroad spur being built to Denver, cattle prices are bound to rise substantially. This was a calculated gamble. Thomas had no idea if such a spur was planned, but it was a common enough development in the rapidly expanding West to be plausible. Pinkerton stroked his mustache, considering. An equity arrangement. It's unorthodox, but potentially lucrative if the ranch returns to full production. He glanced around the table, his gaze lingering on the three women. "Of course, I would need to confirm all this with Sullivan himself. When exactly do you expect his return?" The moment of truth had arrived, and Thomas could feel the tension radiating from the sisters. Rebecca answered smoothly, "My husband should return within the month. His business in Chicago concerns precisely the railroad connections Mr. Morgan mentioned." She met Pinkerton's suspicious gaze without flinching. "You're welcome to leave your proposal with us, and he will contact you directly upon his return." Pinkerton's eyes narrowed. "I think perhaps I should wait for him here. A few weeks is a small price for ensuring the bank's interests are protected." Thomas recognized the threat in the suggestion. Once established on the property, Pinkerton and his men would be difficult to dislodge. Unfortunately, the ranch house can't accommodate additional guests at present. Thomas interjected firmly. "As you can see, we're in the midst of renovations." He gestured to some conveniently unfinished woodwork in the corner. "But the hotel in town is quite comfortable. I stayed there myself before accepting the foreman position." After further negotiations and thinly veiled threats, Pinkerton reluctantly agreed to return in 1 month to meet with Sullivan. As the banker and his men rode away, Thomas and the three women watched from the porch, maintaining their composed facade until the riders disappeared over the horizon. Only then did Rebecca allow her shoulders to slump slightly. "That buys us some time," she said quietly, "but not a solution." Thomas nodded grimly. "Pinkerton will be back, with more men and fewer pretenses at civility, if Sullivan doesn't materialize." Catherine's face hardened. "We could arrange an accident for him as well. The north pasture has room for one more." Thomas shook his head. A banker from Denver disappearing would bring too much attention. "We need a different approach." Mary, who had been unusually quiet throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. "What if Jeremiah Sullivan did return? Just long enough to sign whatever papers the bank requires?" The audacity of Mary's suggestion left them momentarily speechless. "Are you suggesting we find someone to impersonate Sullivan?" Catherine asked incredulously. Mary shook her head, a sly smile playing at her lips. "No, I'm suggesting Mr. Morgan here could be Jeremiah Sullivan." She turned to Thomas. "You're about the right age and build. Anyone who knew him well is long gone. He made sure of that. With the right clothes and a story about illness changing his appearance, Thomas considered the proposal with growing interest. It was outrageous, illegal, and potentially dangerous, but it might work. "I'd need to know everything about him," he said slowly. "His mannerisms, his history, his business dealings. I'd have to become Jeremiah Sullivan in every way that matters to convince Pinkerton." Rebecca studied Thomas thoughtfully. "It could work," she acknowledged. "Few people here knew Jeremiah well. He preferred to remain mysterious, cultivating different stories about his past depending on who he was speaking to." A bitter smile crossed her face. The real Jeremiah Sullivan was a fabrication himself. Even I never knew his true name or origins. Catherine remained skeptical. "And what happens after you convince Pinkerton? You simply ride away and leave us to manage on our own again?" The question hung in the air between them. Thomas realized he was at a crossroads. The vengeance that had driven him for 5 years was no longer possible, but perhaps justice could still be served. Justice for himself and for these women who had suffered at Sullivan's hands. "I won't be riding away," Thomas said, finally, coming to a decision. "If I'm to become Jeremiah Sullivan, then Blackwater becomes my home. And you three," he paused, weighing his next words carefully, "become my responsibility. Not as owner or master, but as partner. We'll rebuild this place together, make it profitable again." He extended his hand to Rebecca. "I know cattle and horses. I can handle men and guns when needed. With your knowledge of the ranch and my experience, we can make Blackwater work." Rebecca hesitated only briefly before taking his offered hand. "Partners," she agreed, her grip firm and decisive. Catherine and Mary exchanged glances before nodding their agreement as well. A new alliance was formed on the porch of Blackwater Ranch, born of shared suffering and a common enemy, now bound by mutual need and the promise of a future none of them had imagined possible just days before. The following weeks were a flurry of activity as they prepared for both Pinkerton's return and the arrival of the promised ranch hands. Thomas used funds he'd set aside for his original mission to hire a small crew of cowboys in town, carefully selecting men without deep roots or connections who wouldn't ask too many questions about the ranch's unusual management arrangement. The North Pasture, which Thomas deliberately avoided examining too closely, was secured against rustlers, and cattle were rounded up from the far corners of the property to present the image of a thriving operation. Rebecca taught Thomas everything she knew about Sullivan, his signature, his business practices, his preferences and habits. Catherine altered Sullivan's remaining clothes to fit Thomas, while Mary, who had a talent for storytelling, helped craft a convincing narrative about illness and recovery to explain any discrepancies in Sullivan's appearance or behavior. As the appointed day approached, Thomas found himself standing before a mirror in Sullivan's former bedroom, dressed in the dead man's suit, practicing the man's distinctive signature for the 100th time. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had come to Blackwater to kill Jeremiah Sullivan, but would instead become him. Rebecca entered quietly, watching his transformation with a complex expression. "You look the part," she said after a moment, though the real Sullivan never had such kindness in his eyes. Thomas met her gaze in the mirror. "Perhaps this is a chance to rewrite history," he suggested, "to make the name Sullivan stand for something better than it did." Rebecca moved closer, straightening his collar with practiced hands. "Perhaps," she agreed softly, though some ghosts are not so easily exorcised. Pinkerton arrived precisely on schedule, this time accompanied by a lawyer and several more armed men, a clear indication of his expectations for the meeting. Thomas, now fully inhabiting the role of Jeremiah Sullivan, greeted them on the porch with confident authority, apologizing for his prolonged absence and expressing gratitude for the bank's patience. Pinkerton's obvious surprise at actually finding Sullivan present quickly gave way to suspicious scrutiny. "You look different, Sullivan," he observed, studying Thomas's face intently. Thomas smiled disarmingly, gesturing to a prominent scar on his cheek, a real wound from the war that now served his deception. "Fever will do that to a man, Pinkerton. Chicago doctors saved my life, but the recovery was transformative." He coughed slightly for effect. "Now, I understand you have a proposal regarding my loans. Let's discuss it like gentlemen." Inside, the negotiations proceeded more favorably than any of them had dared hope. Pinkerton, convinced he was dealing with the real Sullivan, was amenable to restructuring the loans in exchange for a modest equity stake in the ranch's profits. The lawyer drew up the necessary paperwork, which Thomas signed with Sullivan's practiced flourish. Throughout the meeting, Rebecca, Catherine, and Mary maintained their supportive roles, providing documentation when requested and refreshments when appropriate. By late afternoon, agreements had been reached, papers signed, and Pinkerton departed with reluctant satisfaction, promising to return in 6 months to assess the ranch's progress. As the dust from their horses faded on the horizon, the 4 partners exchanged looks of triumph and relief. The immediate crisis had been averted. That evening, they celebrated their success with a bottle of Sullivan's finest whiskey, saved for special occasions. Seated around the dining table, they toasted their unlikely partnership and the future of Blackwater Ranch. "To new beginnings," Thomas proposed, raising his glass. "And to justice served in unexpected ways." Rebecca clinked her glass against his. "To partners who share everything," she added, with a meaningful glance at her sisters. Catherine and Mary joined the toast, their earlier suspicions of Thomas notably diminished. As the whiskey warmed their spirits and loosened their tongues, conversation flowed more freely than it had before. They shared stories of their lives before Sullivan, of dreams deferred and hopes abandoned. Thomas spoke of his years in the cavalry, of the small Wyoming ranch he'd built with Elizabeth, of the life they'd planned together before violence had shattered it all. As night deepened, Mary, the youngest and most forward of the sisters, leaned toward Thomas with a playful smile. "You know, Mr. Morgan, or should I say, Mr. Sullivan, there's still the matter of sleeping arrangements to consider." Catherine shot her a warning glance, but Mary continued undeterred. "If you're to be convincing as Jeremiah, people will expect certain arrangements to be maintained." Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly, catching Rebecca's eye across the table. She studied him thoughtfully before speaking. "Mary has a point, though she expresses it poorly. Appearances matter in our situation, but," she added firmly, "real choices matter more. We've had enough of men making decisions for us." She rose from her chair, her dignity intact despite the difficult conversation. "Whatever arrangements we come to will be by mutual agreement, with respect on all sides." With that declaration, Rebecca bid them good night and retired upstairs, followed shortly by Catherine. Mary lingered, regarding Thomas with curious eyes. "We've learned to share many things to survive," she said cryptically, before following her sisters. Left alone with his thoughts and the remnants of the whiskey, Thomas contemplated the strange turn his life had taken. He had come to Blackwater, seeking an end, the bloody conclusion to his quest for vengeance. Instead, he had found a beginning, a chance to build something meaningful from the ashes of tragedy. The sisters, too, seemed to be offering a kind of redemption, not just partnership in business, but perhaps something more personal as well. The nature of that offer remained ambiguous, deliberately so, he suspected. They were giving him time and space to consider what kind of man Jeremiah Sullivan would be in his second life. Dawn found Thomas already awake, seated on the porch with coffee as he watched the ranch come to life. The newly hired hands were leading horses from the stable, preparing for a day of mending fences on the North Range. In the kitchen, he could hear the sisters preparing breakfast, their voices a harmonious counterpoint to the rugged sounds of the frontier morning. Rebecca joined him on the porch, her own coffee steaming in the cool air. "You're up early," she observed, taking the seat beside him. Thomas nodded, gesturing toward the bustling activity. "Been thinking about what needs doing. The east pasture should be cleared for new grazing. The roof on the barn won't last another winter. And we need to determine how many head we can bring to market this fall to satisfy Pinkerton while maintaining our bleeding stock." Rebecca smiled at his practical assessment, already thinking like a rancher rather than an avenger. It wasn't a question but an observation. Thomas considered it, surprised to realize how quickly his focus had shifted. "Vengeance is a poor companion for the long trail," he admitted. "It keeps you moving, but offers no destination worth reaching." He turned to face her directly. "I've spent 5 years chasing a ghost, only to find that killing him wouldn't have restored what I lost. Perhaps building something new is a better tribute to Elizabeth's memory than more bloodshed would have been." Rebecca's expression softened at the mention of his wife. "And what will you build here, Thomas Morgan, wearing another man's name?" The question held layers of meaning, addressing not just the ranch's future, but his own place within it. Before Thomas could answer, Catherine and Mary emerged from the house, carrying platters of breakfast. The four of them sat together on the porch, eating and discussing the day's work ahead as the sun climbed higher in the Colorado sky. The conversation flowed naturally, marked by shared purpose and growing trust. As they finished their meal, Thomas finally responded to Rebecca's earlier question. "I think Jeremiah Sullivan died as he lived, violently and alone, having built nothing of lasting value. Thomas Morgan died too, in a way, when he lost everything that mattered. Perhaps what we're building here is a chance for both men to be laid properly to rest, while something better rises in their place." He looked at each of the women in turn, these unlikely allies who had become something more. "Don't be afraid," he told them, echoing words they had once spoken in very different circumstances. "We share everything now. The work, the risk, the reward. That's what partners do." The women exchanged glances, a silent communication born of their shared history. Then Rebecca extended her hand across the table, palm up in invitation. "Partners," she affirmed, as Catherine and Mary added their hands to hers. Thomas completed the circle, his weathered hand joining theirs in silent compact. Around them, Blackwater Ranch stirred with new life and purpose under the vast Colorado sky. The past could not be undone, the dead could not be restored, but the future stretched before them like an unwritten page. As the morning sun bathed them in golden light, Thomas Morgan, now Jeremiah Sullivan in name, if not in nature, felt something he had fought forever lost. the quiet certainty of having found his way home. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.